right now.
Um, yeah, hello everyone, and I think there are more people coming, so maybe we can wait around 2 more minutes. Okay, thank you. Okay, welcome to the guest talk session of the BCSR reading group, the Statecraft and Religion in East Asia. And this reading group is supported by the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion, but over the past 3 years, it has turned into an intellectual community that connects graduate students and young scholars beyond Berkeley. As the organizer of this reading group today, I'm very honored to invite Dr. Joshua Tan to join us, giving a lecture titled Overseas China to Asia America, Exiled Missionaries and Stranded Scholars in the Early Cold War United States. And Dr. Tan is currently a postdoctoral research fellow in the Department of History at the National University of Singapore. And he received his PhD degree from the Department of History at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And Dr. Tan's research focuses on the transnational Chinese educational and the cultural politics in Cold War Asia, as well as the religious practices and institutions in Chinese diaspora across the Pacific. Now he's completing a book tentatively titled Chinese International Students in the Americas Cold War, a Trans-Pacific History. And for this event, we are also very honored to have Professor Carolyn Chen as the discussant. Professor Chen is a professor in the Department of Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, as well as the co-director of the Berkeley Center for the Study of Religion. Professor Chen has also several books, including Getting Stable in America, Taiwanese Immigration and the Religious Experience, and Work Play Code, and when work becomes religion in Silicon Valley. And this makes today a wonderful opportunity for us to have two experts of religious issues among Asian diaspora in dialogue with one another. Today's session will consist of two parts. First, Dr. Chan's talk will last approximately 45 to 50 minutes. Then it will followed by the general discussion for about 40 minutes, and including comments from a discussant and questions from the audience. And many thanks. Okay, so that's my brief introduction to both the speaker and the discussant today. And now I will invite Dr. Tan to share his talk.
Okay, so thanks everybody for being here, and thanks Shuhu for the very generous introduction and also for inviting me to speak. So I appreciate everybody kind of coming out on a Sunday afternoon, evening. It's Monday morning here in Singapore, so I really look forward to sharing some of my research as well as to our conversation later. So by way of introduction, maybe I'll just say that this is a project developing from research as part of my dissertation and now current book project that looks at the role of Chinese students and scholars in the diaspora in developing new universities in Cold War Asia, right? In places like Singapore, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, right? How Chinese international students, scholars outside of China became very influential in producing new hubs of higher education in Asia. Right. And so the broad project that I worked on for a number of years really looked at the life histories of, a number of Chinese students and scholars who were in the US in the 1950s, but ended up kind of returning to, so kind of moving to Asia, right? Creating links between American universities and Asian higher education during this Cold War period, right? At a moment of geopolitical tensions between the United States and China. But of course, in the course of this research, I also picked up a lot of materials about Chinese students and scholars of that generation who really just remained in the U.S. right, became American citizens, and of course within this period, right, there was a lot of different mobilities. The overwhelming number of students elected to stay in the U.S. right, and so uh, I found, their stories and experiences really also quite interesting and very much well documented, and even much more so than those that return to Asia. Right. So this paper is really my attempt to try and think through and reflect on the different trajectories of student communities at moments of flux and geopolitical change, right, both past and present, right, and thinking about how international students, right, Chinese students in this context were uniquely positioned in the middle of the 20th century to leverage different resources to reshape their own lives in the latter half of the 20th century. Right. So let me just begin with a quick story, right? So in an October 1966 issue of the South Bend Tribune in Indiana, journalist Louis Purvis reported animatedly about the presence of a group of distinguished China-born professionals and intellectuals gathered at Lake Wawasee in Indiana for a summer camp. Right, the local news media reportage made a great deal of their professional identities. Right, camp director, a youthful appearing Dr. Ruth Wong, right, who talked to journalists while still in her bathing suit, right, was noted as a distinguished medical doctor formerly of Lingnan University in Canton, now an associate professor at the University of Illinois. Her husband, Y.C. Wong, formerly of National Central University in Nanjing and a graduate of the Illinois Institute of Technology, was one of the most renowned Chinese American architects in Chicago. Right, Francis L.K. Shu, who led the discussion of this community group about Chinese culture and identity, was not simply any parent, right, talking to his children and friends about their identity and heritage, but was noted as Northwestern's top anthropologist, right? So among the 22 families gathered there were similarly illustrious China-born professionals, scientists, engineers, professors, and doctors dedicated to instructing their collective 51 children on the meaning of their Chinese American identities. Right. So beginning in 1959, with 8 China-born families coming together to help their American-born children learn Chinese heritage and culture, this annual Chinese family camp, right, hosted by the Chicago-based nonprofit called the Midwest CSAS, Chinese Student and Alumni Services, had now become a beloved affair. Right, local news media reported was constantly fascinated by this group of highly educated and upwardly mobile immigrants, right? As the Fort Wayne Sentinel described the Chinese family camp in 1961, it was a group that comprised at least 2 Christian ministers, an eye doctor, a radiologist, dietitians, space scientists, chemists, mathematicians, mechanical, bridge, civil engineers, several professors, psychiatrists, medical doctors, and more. Right, so this was a very extraordinary group that really captured local media attention. Right, so this community of Chinese American families organized around the Midwest CSAS, right, in many ways exemplifies what historian Madeline Shu has described as the good immigrants, former international students and scholars residing in the US who were celebrated in post-war America as model minorities for their professional status, upwardly mobile trajectories, and their visible contributions to local and national life. All had arrived in the US first on student visas, but remained in the United States following the Communist Revolution of 1949. Many took up permanent residency in the US under the Refugee Relief Act of 53. And this specific community, organized around Chicago's Midwest CSAS, I'll talk more about these organizations later on, the Chinese Student and Alumni Services, was in fact established by a Protestant mission board, right, the United Board for Christian Colleges in China. Previously, they had been very much involved in building and shaping universities and colleges in China, but now had been cut off from its sponsored institutions following the Chinese Communist Revolution and the Korean War. Right, so in today's talk, I want to make 2 arguments. And so first, I want to just demonstrate how, right, in the aftermath of 1949 Communist Revolution, the rupture of U.S. China ties after the Korean War, exiled China missionaries, now displaced from their mission field in China, sought to shore up support from the Chinese diaspora, right, this kind of overseas China, as an extension of their missions in China, right, conserving human resources for future educational reconstruction in China, right? And so this unexpectedly provided Chinese students in the US an invaluable source of resources for community building support while facilitating their integration into social professional life as in the United States at a moment of great geopolitical uncertainty, right? And secondly, I also want to demonstrate, but by the mid-1950s, right, these missions as well as their sponsored students' pathways began to diverge, right? Sponsoring organizations like the United Board began to redirect their attention to Asia, right? But few of the Chinese students, were willing to return, right? Perhaps unsurprisingly, the communities that had been established in this interim period now took on new levels of permanency. Right, and so in terms of the scholarship, I won't talk too much about the literature, but really kind of this essay hopes to engage with the body of scholarship about the Chinese international student experience in the 20th century US By centering the Cold War 1950s as a really overlooked period that produced new kind of local student and community organizations, right? So much of the scholarship on this topic is really focused on the early 20th century, right? Historians like Ye Wei-li, right? Seeking Modernity in China's Name looks at the first generation of Chinese students in the US from the late Qing dynasty to the early Republic, right? Focusing on how this generation, used the American education to help modernize China, right? In comparison, scholars like Him Mark Lai, who were focused in the 50s, really describe a world characterized by McCarthyism, like the Red Scare on American campuses, FBI surveillance that, dissolved like long-standing Chinese student organizations like the Chinese Student Christian Association, for instance, because of their purported leftist ties. Yet, as historian Charlotte Brooks has noted, right, the Cold War in Chinese America was really also a time of political ferment and activism, right? Not only limited but also facilitated by kind of intersecting local and global politics. And so today I want to demonstrate through the United Board's kind of an examination of United Board's work and its the kind of CSAS in particular, how dissolution of some student communities in this period of geopolitical uncertainty gave rise to the reconstruction and development of others. By centering the role of religious missionary groups like the United Board in shaping post-war Asian American communities, right, and this generative interplay between exiled missionaries, students, scholars in the early Cold War United States, I further want to demonstrate how Cold War ruptures in Sino-American relations now produce generative consequences on both sides of the Pacific. There is, of course, I think, a well-known body of scholarship, right, critical of missionary Orientalism, the collusion between missionaries and Western imperialism in Asia, that I think is well known, not least by somebody like Mao Zedong himself, right? A very well known editorial, Farewell Leighton Stewart, right, published in the People's Daily in August of 1949, right, criticizing the longtime president missionary of Yenjing University and post-war U.S. ambassador in China. Right. So, but here I want to go beyond these simple criticisms of missionaries, imperialism, so on, and building on more recent work by scholars like David Hollinger, who have really used the missionary archive to illustrate the multiple dimensions of this missionary enterprise in Asia, right? The contributions to intellectual and social and cultural life in America that go way beyond its original goals and way beyond the boundaries of church history. Right. In particular, as a historian, I argue that, centering this missionary archive, right, that's, hitherto really been only used to study higher education in China, is a valuable and untapped resource into the worlds of Chinese students in post-war America, which missionaries initially regarded as simply extensions of his work in China, right? So I won't go too much into this, but a lot of scholars of post-war immigration in the US have really looked at government archives, right? Archives of the State Department, immigration services, etc. And the U.S. government really, if we look at an archive, it really sees students or international students, the problems of state overstaying visas, etc., essentially as a bureaucratic problem to be resolved, right? But if we're centering this missionary archive, right, I found a very very rich archive of correspondences, letters between former missionaries, the students, many of them who had long-standing relationships, right? And so it helps us to center kind of different kind of experience that we don't often get by looking at government documents. And in fact, I think it also helps us to make visible for this post 1949 generation of Chinese students in America what historian David Yu has described as the religious experience of migration and exile, right, centering the ambivalences of mobility that problematize triumphalist narratives of America as a promised land or land of immigrants. So today in my talk, I'm going to really proceed in three parts, right? So I trace how American missionaries from China, right, displaced by the Communist Revolution of 49, encountered and engaged with Chinese students in America. Right, first I'm going to introduce briefly, right, who were the exiled missionaries, who were the stranded scholars, right, through the case of the United Board for Christian higher colleges in China, right? And then secondly, I'm going to chart, right, this divergence of interest, right, as United Board, right, this American mission board began to channel its resources to rebuilding universities in Asia, right? How their pathways diverged from the Chinese students it was sponsoring in the US, right? And finally, I want to take the case of the Midwest CSAS and Chinese family camp, based out of Chicago, the Midwest, to demonstrate how a community that was founded right in this interim period of missionary sponsorship and organization ultimately became a thriving, vibrant local community shorn off from its founding ideals. And so I just want to appreciate also the community of Midwest CSAS and Chinese Family Camp, some of the members in the audience, especially Alan Yang, who's provided a lot of the resources, images, and upon which I was able to write this paper. So I really look forward to your input and your the conversation later on. Okay, so let me just start off with part one then, right? The emergency program, right? Exiled missionaries, stranded scholars in the United States, right? Going to talk who were the exiled missionaries, who were the stranded scholars, right? So, of course, in the aftermath of 1949, Communist Revolution, right? The outbreak of open hostilities between American and Chinese troops on the Korean Peninsula in 1950, right? This was a moment of major geopolitical changes. And there was movements across multiple directions, but I think overwhelmingly this is characterized by, kind of a reluctant exodus of some sorts of many American government as well as private organizations working, who worked, of course, for many, many years in China, right, under the Republican government. And so one of the most kind of important, I think, organizations for the purposes of students and higher education was a group called the United Board for Christian Colleges in China, right? They were basically a kind of born out of ecumenical cooperation among the various American mission boards, right? A coordinating body for 13 American Protestant-sponsored Christian colleges in China. Right. Of course, they had a very sizable network of colleges and, of course, alumni as well, right? So if we, look at from the vantage point of America as well, of the roughly 5,000 Chinese students and scholars who were living in the US, right, in the immediate aftermath post 1949-50, one count by the China Institute of America notes that roughly 70% of these Chinese students and scholars in the US had some kind of prior ties with Christian affiliated schools and colleges in China, right? Oftentimes, their pathways to America were also mediated by these institutional relationships, right? So whether or not they were Christians, right, this is more of kind of institutional affiliations, right? The kind of formative schooling in China, right? So the United Board, I will also say that just for the purposes of this talk, there was something different from the well-known China lobby in the US, right? Kind of very ideologically opposed to communism, right? This and kind of lobbyists for the nationalist government in Taiwan, right? So you can think of figures like former missionary Minnesota Congressman Walter Judd, for instance, right? A very pro Chiang Kai-shek position, right? The United Board's leadership was somewhat more complex, right? Of course, I think they were opposed to communism, but they were also somewhat sympathetic to the PRC, right? The early PRC, and in the interim period between the Communist Revolution of 49 until the outbreak of Korean War, when missionary funds were embargoed, right, from entering China, they had initially actually still hoped to continue working in China, but simply replacing Western missionary personnel with Chinese leadership. So I just nuance that first, right? So, of course, in the aftermath of, what the the cutting off of ties between American kind of mission board as well as colleges. Of course, what they started to do was to look other places to disperse their assistance, right? And in this work, right, this is taking place roughly late 1950, 51. Of course, a very, very important reference point was, World War II, right, where the Christian colleges on the eastern coast of China simply moved towards the inland, towards west and southwest China, continued their work and were looking for a time where they could kind of return to their campuses in coastal China after the war, right? So initially there was that thought, right? So kind of moving the missionary personnel and resources elsewhere. And of course, in this period, we can look at, some of their flagship publications, what used to be a bulletin called the China Colleges, right? Organized around the various institutions, became, on the right-hand side, right? The spirit of the China Colleges, right? Continuing in Christian service for Chinese wherever they may be reached. So what the board's leadership started to do in late 1951, early 52, right, was to dispatch its executive secretary all across the world, right, looking for Chinese wherever they may be reached, right, especially Chinese students and Chinese scholars. That gave rise to quite interesting archive in terms of survey data and so on, and looking where Chinese education could be continued in the diaspora, right? Right. Executive Secretary William Fenn describes that, they had to glimpse fresh horizons, right, of service, of fresh fields of service beyond campuses in China, right, making a case that this board could not simply sit out an indefinite stage of history in exile, right? He noted a 1951-52 report to the trustees that the board could now put its rich store of experience and substantial financial resources now to serve Chinese educational needs outside China, right? So he was traveling all across Asia, right? Across Hong Kong, Malaya, and so on. But of course, given that the United Board's office was located in New York City, right, in 150 Fifth Avenue, right, it was perhaps also inevitable that it would be drawn into ongoing debates in the US about the what at the time, right, was described as a problem of stranded Chinese students in the Cold War America, right? I won't go too much into this, right? What Chinese American sociologists, right, famously refer to the stranded Chinese, right? The scholars and students in the United States who were distinct from kind of working class Chinese American communities, right? And so the idea of the stranded was kind of circulated in the 1950s, basically because of immigration technicalities, right? These referred to Chinese students who had entered the US on student visas, but were now unable or unwilling to return to communist China, right? Um, in fact, as recent scholarship has demonstrated, the US government, in fact, assisted many of these students to try and return to China, even to communist China, but for the fact that some limited numbers of students with scientific and technological expertise were prevented from doing so by the Justice Department, right? So these so-called stranded scholars, in many ways were so-called, we can think of them as victims, as casualties of Cold War geopolitics. But from another lens, we can say they were also beneficiaries of US government assistance, right? They were given, provisions for kind of continuing to stay and then applying for permanent residency in the US. And they received multiple sources of support, right? A $10.5 million grant from the US State Department, as well as, multiple proxies of the US government, as well as from missionaries and educational nonprofits like the United Board as well, right? The logic, of course, of United Board, right, as they kind of developed this Committee on Services in America, was to provide both material and spiritual support to Chinese students in the diaspora, right? It established in 1952 two subcommittees of services in America on scholarships, right, providing material support to Chinese students, as well as what they described as Chinese students and alumni services, right, to provide services, spiritual care, counseling, and guidance for students, at this very kind of moment of uncertainty, right? Of course, they were linked, right, in a way, kind of material and spiritual support, right? To conserve students, kind of conserve these human resources in the diaspora, right? Preparing for a future return to China at some point, right? Look at this this is the definition, right? That they justify to the Board of Trustees, right? It's a much needed missionary work among a group of intelligent, refined, frustrated people, specialists of various kinds who are professionally competent but now socially alienated, right? In the US, right? Many of them are Christians. They have demonstrated qualities of leadership, and they may become outstanding leaders back in China, right? When China was so-called liberated from communism, right? It was aspiring to. Okay, so scholarships I think is straightforward, right? So they were giving scholarships to various students, completing their degrees and so on. But I think one of the interesting kind of institutions was also what they called Chinese Student and Alumni Services Centers in the US, right? And this work really was driven by veteran China missionaries who found new opportunities to keep working with Chinese students, right? So these were missionaries that had taught for many years in the Christian colleges in China, right, who were now able to use their language, their cultural fluency to continue working among students in the US, right? With support from the National Council of Churches, right, the United Board developed 5 centers of CSAS centers in various metropolitan areas: Seattle, Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, and New York, right, with many other centers established in ex-missionaries' homes and local churches, right? So we can see, some of the missionaries really extensive experiences, right? For instance, Don Irwin, who led the CSAS Center in Seattle, right, had 30 years in China under the Presbyterian Board. Dr. Louis Wolferts, right, one of the first, who had first professors who went to Beijing in 1911, was on the inaugural faculty of Tsinghua in 1917, right? Served at Yenching University from 1917 to 51, right? So, very, very extensive experience in China, now kind of working with Chinese students in the diaspora, right? The missionary Ellen Studley, or house is pictured here, was also organizing a very, very important community CSAS center in Chicago, right? So this was the contribution of the United Board, right? And so within the CSAS, centers quite a bit of a very rich archive about the kind of anxieties, dilemmas of Chinese students in that period. Many of them were getting married, right, looking for employment. So you got a whole kind of range of problems and, anxieties and hopes and aspirations that they were kind of writing, to the CSAS secretaries as well as to many of the missionaries, right, who were much more experienced and, giving them guidance on how to navigate American life. Of course, the United Board, of course, was very significant, but it was not the only organization that was working with Chinese students in America, right? It was actually working also collaboratively with many others, right? So one of the more, I think, well-known community or kind of, I guess, educational nonprofits based in New York was the China Institute in America, right? Uh, another kind of organization that was working in terms of kind of international student advising, cultural diplomacy efforts. And so with the China Institute, right, United Board also was co-sponsoring uh, various initiatives such as a Chinese personnel survey, and helping Chinese students and graduates find professional employment, right? Publishing, co-sponsoring the publication of the Directory of Chinese Members of American Colleges and University Faculties, right? Helping Chinese students connect with Chinese faculty at the various universities and also finding jobs, right? They also had some kind of, encountering other Christian organizations that were also trying to do the same thing, right? Remember there was a whole big legacy of, Christian higher educational efforts in China. So, I just talk about one other center that established itself very near to the New York CSAS, that was Sino-American Amity, that was founded by the Archbishop of Nanjing, Paul Yubin. So I won't talk too much, but basically they were also doing the same thing, trying to reach out to and kind of organize Chinese Catholic students, with one caveat that they were not simply working with Chinese in America, but they were also trying to bring in Chinese Catholic students from Hong Kong, from Taiwan. They were even more ambitious in some ways, you can say, from the CSAS. CSAS centers also started to encounter other maybe challenges, right? In contrast to the more ecumenically oriented programs that, it was kind of a big tent approach, right? New York CSAS reported, right, that they were also ceding ground to more aggressive, conservative evangelical movements around Reformed Church in Queens, right? So they were, encountering many other, perhaps, Christian inspired community groups that have slightly different theological focus as well. Right? There was a lot of energy, right? So there are many students in need of support, but also various different community groups coming up to try and organize them. Okay, so part two, right? Pivot to Asia, right? So while the United Board, of course, still regarded their work in America, right, with the students in the U.S. as a continuation or extension of their Christian missionary movement in China, by about 1953-54, there was a growing awareness that there were more pertinent needs in Asia that demanded their attention, right? Following a series of visits to East and Southeast Asia, the board's leadership now acknowledged that it was not only these about 5,000 Chinese students and scholars in the US, but rather what they described as the 20 million overseas Chinese scattered across East and Southeast Asia that required much more resources, right? In the kind of board's documents, right, the letters to the trustees, you can see when they talked about the Chinese diaspora, right, increasingly it was less reference to America and more to Asia. Right, writing in 1952, Executive Secretary William P. Fenn describes that he came back from Asia with with a continued significance that the United Board should be working among Chinese, right, and particularly the 20 million Chinese across Asia, right, the 8 to 10 million in Formosa, the 2 million in Hong Kong, and the various others in Thailand, Malaya, Indonesia, Philippines, that the United Board was only starting to encounter, right? So we can look at this map, right, across the Pacific, where they were trying to stretch out their work all across in different directions. By 1953, their flagship publication, China Colleges, is named New Horizons. 1955, the United Board for Christian Colleges in China becomes renamed the United Board for Christian Higher Education in Asia, right, reflecting a much broader geographical focus, right? We can see the budgets too, the 1954-55 program on the right side. Services in North America remain about a constant $100,000 or so, but by 53, their budgets in Asia are really increasing, right? Especially we can see with the formation of a new Christian college in Taiwan, right? Donghai University, which is eating up the majority of the budget, as well as other services in Asia, right? Sponsoring pre-existing Christian colleges and universities in East and Southeast Asia, like Silliman University in the Philippines, International Christian University in Japan, Tongji College in Hong Kong, right? So this is a kind of broadening network that previously didn't exist. So of course, ostensibly, of course, there is no relationship at all between these new universities in Asia, right? And the Chinese students and scholars in America, right? Many of whom would become permanent residents, right, on their way to becoming US citizens. But a survey of the correspondences and dossiers of the United Board revealed that many of the students who took up scholarships in that interim period, right, 1950, 51, 52, did evidence a willingness to return to Asia, right, if returns to China were no longer possible, right? So it's quite interesting to look at some of this, the letters and the multiple, instances of this. Somebody like Paul Chow, right, University of Chicago Medical School, right, justifying his, application for scholarship that he was willing to work elsewhere in the Orient, right, if it should prove impossible to return to Chinese mainland. Another master's candidate at NYU, right, writes that I shall go back to China and serve my country if conditions permit, right? If not, he'd like to work among the overseas Chinese in Southeast Asia, Malaya, the Philippines, or even the States, right? Promoting Christian ideals, helping to solve economic problems, right? Feng Ming Chu, right? Somebody that become play a key role in the Chicago CSAS later on. He writes initially, right? I hope I can go somewhere in the Orient, right? Anywhere to serve some of our Chinese brothers and sisters in whatever way I can. Right. So with the changes to United Board's policy and its new network of sponsored institutions in Asia, right, then now this nebulous idea of somewhere in the Orient, right, increasingly becomes anchored to new universities and colleges under the board's network. But so we can look no further than to the staffing of Zhonghai University, right, East China Sea University in Taiwan, which posed the greatest challenges and indeed some disappointments to the United Board. Right, I won't say too much about the institutional history, but suffice to say that, it was one of the most ambitious efforts that, by American nonprofit at kind of founding a new American style liberal arts college in kind of Cold War Taiwan. Right. So Donghai University was kind of distinct from all the other institutions that the United Board was founding, is that, United Board played a very, very significant role in founding the university, an active role in charting its educational vision, curriculum, personnel decisions, and so on. But, ironically, right, although it had hoped that many of the students it was supporting in the US were going to return to Taiwan and serve on the faculty and develop the curriculum, so on, very few prepared to do so. Right. The most direct reason, of course, was that many of them who had already become American permanent residents were now waiting to fulfill their residency requirements for U.S. citizenship. Right. So one example, there are many of these, dossiers, but somebody like Eugene Wu, right, who was kind of recent graduate, was overjoyed by the opportunity to serve at the university to bear Christian witness to the young people at Donghai. Right. He said there's nothing better he would like to do than to go immediately, but because he had already taken up, permanent residency, started his naturalization proceedings, right? He wasn't able to go anywhere for more than 12 months. Another scholar, so Eugene Wu, of course, he was a young librarian, right? Later on, will go to a very illustrious career at the Hoover Institute and then Harvard Yenching Library, right? So he eventually became a U.S. citizen, right? Played a big role in developing kind of sinology, East Asian studies in the U.S., right? Another scholar, right, Zhu Youguang, right? Somebody who had, previously been on the faculty at Lingnan and Yenching universities, right? He was excited by the idea personally, but his own wishes to settle his family in the US and desire to maintain job security compelled him to decline. Right, he says ever since 1937, right, outbreak of Sino-Japanese War, he was in Beijing at the time, right. He had not known any security and stability, lived through so many periods of anxiety, right. He was at Skidmore College in New York, right, at the time. So if he left, he would be exchanging stability for a long period of uncertainty ahead, right. He said that he does have ideas that he would like other young people to try, and thus he agreed to serve as a short-term visitor and consultant, which he did later on at Donghai. Of course, from among many of the scholars, there was very much skepticisms of free China, Taiwan, right, particularly under the nationalist government, right. So one of the figures here is Zhu Fengming, right, who was one of the United Board scholarship grantees I mentioned previously, and even took up employment later with the United Board briefly, right. So he laid bare his concerns to United Board's Mary Ferguson, who employed him for a position, right? He actually was studying at National Central University, 1944, right? The cohort, many of whom became conscripted into the nationalist government, doing, various stuff as military attaches, translators, interpreters, so on. And so he joined the nationalist army in 44, 45. And, he writes that, he saw very, very dark things and experienced corruption. And he really kind of lost his faith in the nationalist government. And so, in his very, very extensive long letters. He talks in these biblical, allusions, right? He talks about the book of Jonah, and, whether the government of Formosa will ever repent or not, right? So, it's quite interesting, but it was very, very ambivalent about, going to Taiwan. And so ultimately, like many of his colleagues, he decided against returning to Taiwan, but follows a familiar pattern, taking up position as professor in the US. United Board's resources, nevertheless, played a very important role in shaping his life trajectory, right? Of course, the United Board Scholarship helped him to complete his PhD at the University of Wisconsin. And his first job after graduation actually was not first at the university, but through the United Board's connections on the full-time staff at the Midwest CSAS Center in Chicago, where he worked together with missionary Ellen Studley. And it was at this Midwest CSAS house that he met his wife, Rosemary Young, and where he lived following his marriage. And so, his wife, reflecting on their kind of time together, summarized that, Midwest CSAS in Chicago was a place of romance and adventure, which brought them irreversible changes to their lives. But so arguably, we can say it was this divergence between the shifting needs and demography of Chinese student community as well as the United Board, which ultimately prompted the termination of its services in North America, including the well-beloved CSAS centers, right? An April 1954 meeting of the board subcommittee and fellowships articulated that, the so-called emergency among those already in the US had passed, right? Now, there was no more waiting for an imminent return to China, but the primary purpose of any fellowships or assistance would really to be providing trained leaderships for Christian higher education in East Asia. Right. Furthermore, the fact that, among the generation of students and scholars who were in the US in 1949-50, right, within a few years, many of them had graduated. They were more accurately described as alumni or even professionals rather than students, right? They were now positioned to remain in America for indefinite periods of time, right? So practical steps were taken to close down all these CSAS centers, right? According to United Board's, own report, there was a mission accomplished, right? As they terminated the funding to all these centers in 57, right? They terminated them gradually, right? So some of them, in Boston, Philadelphia were closed down. The Seattle Center was turned on to the Presbyterian Church. New York Center was merged into Riverside Church Chinese Christian Fellowship. But it was the Midwest CSAS in Chicago was quite exceptional because the Chinese members now opted to fundraise to support the continued operations of CSAS Chicago, independent of any assistance or affiliation with the United Board. Right. The Midwest CSAS, right, of course, was first established by missionary Ellen Studley in 1951, but in the intervening years had become one of the most important Chinese student organizations in the Chicago area, right? So unlike many of the, other metropolitan areas, in New York, for instance, so many concentration of Chinese student community organizations, right? Chicago, it was comparative lack. And so Midwest CSAS filled this very important vacuum, right? Very quickly it made its presence felt across college campuses and towns across the region, right? In addition to supporting a whole series of, weekly community gatherings in Chicago, right? It hosted, three major large-scale events between 53 to 57, Chinese student rally, a family vacation camp, and an Easter service. By the mid-1950s, it emerged, in the words of, Chu Fengming, right, the full-time secretary, as the nerve center for an estimated 2,300 Chinese students and alumni in the Midwest who were part of what he described as the CSAS parish. The house of the CSA, the doors of the CSAS house in Chicago famously opened from 9 a.m. till midnight, where Chinese students could drop in for consultations on immigration affairs, employment, to find lodging, or to even simply find information about friends, right? Other Chinese students or alumni in the region. Thus, when missionary Ellen Studley learned about the withdrawal of funds from the Midwest CSAS, she was among the most insistent on the needs of its continuation, right? She said that though no longer aligned with the board's vision, right? Its work had justified itself so sufficiently that any group attempting to raise funds for it could do so both within the Chinese community and outside, right? Right. So true to her word, October 57, now led by the Chinese members of the community, Midwest CSAS, right, in Chicago was incorporated in Illinois as a Christian non-sectarian, non-political organization dedicated to supporting Chinese students and alumni in the Midwest, within the spirit of Christian concern, right? Now, no longer hampered by any illusions of, an imminent return to China and Asia, the chief purpose of the reincorporated Midwest CSAS was to help Chinese students and alumni live more satisfying and fruitful lives as they integrate into America. the character of their activities and events also, started to turn towards, one that was perhaps more concerned with Chinese politics, right, towards more local community building, right? As I've shown here, some of the some of the early events that they were doing, like the Midwest student rallies, for instance, oftentimes, were headlined with prominent Chinese scholars like Wu Shi, right? Or other, bringing in scholars from Asia, right, to provide updates on intellectual life there. But, as the core group of families around the CSAS now organized started to bond not only about over ruminations on geopolitics, but increasingly over the shared challenges of raising families and children in America. What used to be an adjacent vacation camp, right, on the side of the student rallies now took center stage in programming, as families simply sought a space to socialize and raise their families together, right? So this is kind of images from the earliest kind of vacation camp, right, on the side of the student rallies at a farm in Wisconsin, right, and Indiana. And so following a 1958 attempt to run a 2-week children's study camp on a farm in Wisconsin, right, the Parents Council of the Midwest CSAS decided to organize camps for entire families, right, where all parents collectively could kind of educate their children on the nature of their Chinese identity and language, right? So these are some kind of documents from the 1958 kind of children's study camp. And, although it was really about children, I found it quite interesting, Yang Zhenning, famous scientist, who I think done his doctorate in Chicago, but then moved on to Princeton, was also invited as one of the speakers, right? So you still have these kind of, distinguished scholars coming in to talk with families about, ways they're navigating Chinese identity in America, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so by 1959, right, this formally within the CSAS inaugurated through the Parents Council a Chinese family camp, right, with Professor Joseph Lee of Michigan, right, noting that they owe it to their children born in America to make them rich, heirs of two cultures, right, especially helping them access their Chinese culture and language that otherwise would not be easy for them to do so within this period, right? So they came together every year, I quote, right, to practice Chinese language, learn Chinese games, appreciate Chinese culture. And of course, many came with different expectations, right? Perhaps for the children, the recreational element is key, but for the parents, right, the former students, scholars, and alumni, right, their commitments to cultural immersion was paramount, right? So Clara Chow Chen, one of the parents, writes also this is more publicity from the Chinese family camp in San Francisco's Chinese World, right? So I was mentioning, right, so one of the parents, right, Clara Chow Chen, right, writes in the CFC newsletter that the main purpose for coming to camp really is to learn Chinese and to appreciate Chinese culture, right? It was a cultural kind of education and immersion event, right? Swimming and square dancing you can do elsewhere, right? But it was really an opportunity to study Chinese. Right, I talked to Alan Young, one of the young campers. Of course, he recalled that Auntie Chen, famous for doing an entire Chinese language session on Chinese swear words and curses. Right, and Jean Fong, so one of the other parents, right, reiterated in 1963. Right, Chinese study program is one of the most important camp activities. Right, it's basically to teach children Chinese heritage. 1964, right, a program began to emphasize aspects of Chinese tradition, history, and culture, starting with the great historical personalities of China, like Confucius. Right, in 1965, a theme of studying Chinese geography, right, gave many of the old uncles an opportunity to reminisce about their past lives in China, right, about their hometowns, about their university, college campuses, etc., etc. Right, so for the children, many of whom were born in the 1950s US, right, observing their parents' insistence on Chinese cultural education provided them multiple occasions to reflect on their shared past and family histories that were otherwise foreign to them. Right, Woody Wang, so the son of S.Y. Wang. So Wang Shiyuan, fondly referred to as Uncle Bear, right, according to Alan Young, right? Woody Wang describes this extended family of uncles and aunties, right? About 60 families, all from the same socio-economic background, all have MAs, MDs, or PhDs, as do many of the aunties. They all left China at about the same time, right? So he wrote actually this paper, quite interesting. It's published in the CSAS newsletter. But he wrote it as part of the course at the University of Chicago, right? Trying to unpack the kind of complex kind of social dynamic within the family camp, right? So he interviews one of the anonymous uncles who noted to him, right, when we come together, right, this could pass for a conference in electrical, mechanical, chemical engineering, etc., etc. But they wanted to really emphasize Chinese culture and education because they wanted to help their children know what their Chinese roots were, right? So, by all accounts, I think, and I think this is kind of from my own reading of the newsletters, right? The young campers evidence a genuine curiosity to learn about Chinese culture and history. They participated in, cultural activities with quite much enthusiasm, although I think they resented what an article by Emma Trone describes as the camp's infamous talent night, which oftentimes featured classical music, right? So there's this a separate article written by one of the campers, I think, who became a scholar, right? Emma Trone, right, who describes a performance, right, oftentimes of classical music that was resented by many of the children because they were judged not simply for their musical talent, but as markers of their family's assimilation into kind of the American society. Nevertheless, I think many cherish the close attachments, the multi-generational community, which was, really growing in strength over the years. Right. For Clarence Chen, one of the first campers, he wrote fondly in the CSAS newsletter about the growing number of cousins, right? And how these American-born teenagers, right, who really developed close attachments to the camp, right, himself, right, the essence of the camp spirit was for him a deep feeling of acceptance from others who intuitively and automatically understood the crazy, complex Chinese Americanism because it is also theirs, right. Of course, he wrote, for his parents had a different dilemma, right, how to raise children, and so they were also very attached to this community for those reasons. And the Chinese cultural element for him, I think, was still very deeply personal, right? So he writes, right, and then this was in 1977. He had already moved to New York as doing his medical degree at Columbia, but he came back with his 3-year-old daughter, right? So, and then he writes, witnessing his own 3-year-old daughter singing the old Chinese standard song "San Zhi Lao Fu," right, along with the nursery group in 1977, right? So he writes, that was my truly Chinese American daughter singing her first Chinese song, just as I had done here years ago. As I witnessed the continuation of a cycle, I experienced a sense of overwhelming joy. So I thought this was kind of really beautiful quote. Okay, so kind of just to conclude, I'm running out of time, I know. So in conclusion, right, just wanted to kind of pull back a little bit to the kind of the origin story, right? So that looking at this Cold War rupture in Sino-American relations, right? So I wanted to demonstrate how it's not only this kind of the destructive consequences of that, but also in some ways that it unexpectedly became a generative moment, right, in the mid-20th century, producing new communities of belonging, right? What emerged as an interim program by United Board to disperse China funds to shore up human resources for missions in Asia develops unexpectedly into a thriving Chinese American community. Right. Of course, United Board later, would go on to become one of the leading kind of nonprofit organizations in developing universities and colleges in Asia, right, by one estimate of 1990, right, supporting over 83 institutions in 9 countries. Right. For the Chinese students and alumni of CSAS, right, of course, United Board's role fades into distant memory, right? Maybe some of the first generation student migrants of the 50s still recall the friendly presence of missionaries like Ellen Studley and Harriet Whitmer, right, former professor at Jinling College, that oftentimes came to lead kind of children groups at the family camp. The broader backdrop of shifting geopolitics from mid-20th century has largely receded from view. One of the most interesting things I found out that, within this, doing some of my research with the newsletters, that many of the CSAS, the parents, especially the men, and so I think there's perhaps a gender component too, right? A number of CSAS members, ended up, of course, developing professional careers in American higher education, but also embrace opportunities later in life, right, to reconnect with universities and academics in Asia, right? So this is, I think, mirroring broader kind of patterns within Chinese American scholars engaging in different capacities with educational development on other side of Pacific, right? This is mine is a kind of incomplete survey, but some of the individuals that I kind of follow a little bit, the multiple of them took up positions academicians or academia sinica in Taiwan, right? So Taiwan's kind of foremost national research institute. You have CSAS members that went on to become principals of colleges and universities in Asia, like Mei Yipao and Hong Kong's New Asian College, S.S. Shu, Uncle Shu, and Tsinghua in Taiwan. And then, of course, his son, Frank Shu, also became president at Tsinghua, Taiwan later on. You have individuals engaged in Sino-American diplomacy, like Joseph Lee, right, one of the early kind of initiators of the camp, became a very important member in the first delegation representing CSC-PRC, the Committee for Scholarly Communication with PRC in 1972. Also, others, who after retiring from their careers in the US, like C.T. Tai, right, at University of Michigan, started to take up multiple visiting or honorary professorships at universities in mainland China. Right, and so he also played a role in the internationalization, University of Michigan, with mainland Chinese universities. Right. So, but now, uh, from the other standpoint, of course, the camp itself, right, the community in the Midwest, becomes very, very much more, embedded locally, and approaches towards Chinese heritage identity also shifting as well, right? Camp sessions were no longer only about traditional China, but characterized equally by teenagers simply speaking about more universal problems, right? Parent issues, racial prejudice, dating, job opportunities, etc. So to Clara Chow Chen, right, quote her again. So in the early 60s, you're talking about the importance of Chinese language, but now writing a reflection as a grandmother, right? She talks about generational renewal, right? So in the past, they felt that the ABCs needed to know something really Chinese. So they always invite scholars from all over the country to give lectures like cramming on Chinese culture. But this year, she talks about the younger leadership. I heard teenagers saying among themselves it was the most interesting session they ever had. And so I thought it was also an interesting reflection that this year, 1981 also was the first time the camp was organized after U.S. China normalization relations. She writes, whatever the U.S. China relationship may be, it makes no difference, right? To have little effect on lives of us American Chinese, right? So this was her reflection at the end. Um, so I guess to pull it back to the present, I'm just going to wrap up here that, today, of course, the Midwest Family Camp, continues to exist as an independent entity, thriving through annual meetings, right? But, they're a very, very vibrant community. You can find them online. Midwest CSAS was dissolved in 1990s, right? Donating its assets to Chicago Chinatown-based Chinese American Service League. So, according to Alan Yang, who's this kind of chronicler of Chinese family camp history, right, he's noted to me that now Chinese family camp has evolved, right, to include families from all over the region, many of whom have children adopted from China, and more recently, children with special needs or different abilities as well. So, standing as a vibrant center of Asian American social life today, Chinese family camp remains, I think, one legacy of the complex experiences of the Chinese international student experience from the early Cold War United States, really underscoring how historic moments of rupture in Sino-American relations produce new communities with unexpected legacies. So I'm just going to end there. And thanks very much, everybody, for your attention, for your time. And I really look forward to our conversation later on. Yeah.
Joshua, thank you so much
Yeah.
for your fascinating talk. And this is a
Yeah.
compelling story about how a Christian-oriented association generated unexpected impacts in the transnational Cold War context. And we can definitely see the dynamic interplay between the institutions, policies, the religion, and individual actors in their
Yeah.
story. And yeah, definitely I have lots of questions, but I will now turn to our discussant, Professor Chen, to lead the discussion, to share his comments, to share her comments. Sorry.
Well, thank you so much, Hu, for inviting me to share my comments today. And Dr. Tan, what a pleasure it has been to read your paper. There is so much in here. It's so rich and it was so meaningful to me also just personally because my father did his medical residency. Um, and he immigrated from Taiwan to the United States in 1968, so a little bit later than the folks that you're talking about. But many of these experiences are, part of our family lore, and having to perform piano in front of family camps is still a nightmare that I have to this day. So, so I totally understand that. But I want to tell you that this is like this is your work is really important. I think that there's so much here that you do by centering the missionary archive. I mean, this is just an invaluable resource for really understanding Chinese American life. And I think that there's several important contributions that I see you doing, things that are new and innovative. First is that you're expanding this kind of the conventional story of what happens to Western missionaries to China um, with the Chinese Revolution. The typical story is, well, the missionaries go to Hong Kong, they go to, Malaysia, they go to Taiwan. But what you show here is that actually they come back home and they see a different mission field, right? And that mission field is these Chinese international students. And this is an interesting story because when you look at the literature on missionaries among the Chinese American community in the United States use that tends to be concentrated on the experience of Chinese immigrants in the late 19th to early 20th century, right? So, and then also there are people like Jane Hong, a historian at Occidental College now, who's writing about like the influence of Protestant organizations like InterVarsity among Asian American college students. So there's kind of this gap that you are definitely filling here. This is also you're providing a really important window into Chinese American life that is so you noted a few books like Madeline Chu's book that's looking at Chinese immigrant life, Chinese American life during exclusion, but the bulk of the literature on Chinese American life is either, before exclusion or post 1965. So you've really captured a really important and not very well understood experience of Chinese American life. And then you were able to do it through really an archive that most scholars don't use, which is the missionary archive. So this is wonderful, wonderful stuff. And I love, you use this phrase in your paper, but you didn't use it so much today in your talk, but I really loved it, is the unexpected institutional legacies. And to me, this is really about the unexpected institutional legacies of American Protestantism in Chinese American life. And it creates what I would call, I'm a sociologist, so I use language like path dependency, but it kind of creates a certain kind of path dependency that we see happening that, leads to the establishment of Protestantism as a central institution in Chinese American life that we see later playing out, in the post 1965 immigration, which, I write about as well. Um, I wanted to, there were just a few things that I just thought were just really interesting, that just some of the themes that I think are just so fascinating that I'm personally really interested in and that I see you playing out, that I see you expanding on more in this paper, is education as a missionary project in, among ni the 19th and 20th century missionaries. Um, and so and what I just find so interesting is this the Christian establishment of educational institutions creates a particular kind of religious and class predilection, among the Chinese, and this then later has these implications for a kind of uh, for the creation of a professional and educated class of Christians, both in the home country and in diaspora. And then, as I, talk about, as I just mentioned earlier, it creates like um, it creates what you would call that unexpected institutional legacy, where the importance, which includes, the importance of the Protestant church in Asian American and specifically Chinese American life. Um, I had just a few questions for you. Um, was I was curious about you talk about Chinese as a homogeneous group. And so I'm wondering a little bit more about who you are referring to when you're talking about the Chinese. Um, and particularly when it comes to these Chinese camps, they're learning culture and language, but I'm curious, like, whose culture and whose language? Are they learning Mandarin, or do these camps also include Cantonese, folks who, are speak Cantonese or Taiwanese, or do they create their own camps, right? So what do we mean by Chinese here? I'm curious about that. And then I'm just really curious about um, you tell this story like at first, these students are, they are coming to the United States so that they can go back to Asia, right? And then it becomes clear, like, no, they're not going back to Asia. So the orientation is like, we're going to integrate, we're going to make America home. And then you see this in the development of this, the Midwest CSAC, CSAS, sorry, the Student and Alumni Services, and the creation of these family jobs and this emphasis on cultural heritage. But I'm wondering if there is also, is this maybe it's not in the CSAS archive, but surely during this time, or perhaps it's later that you see also these, Chinese diasporic communities, Chinese American communities also being sources of being highly interested and active in the politics of their home country. So I'm just thinking about Wendy Chang's book, Island X, and maybe this is the story for your next chapter, right? For when we get into the 1970s, and later. But, so many of you know, these kind of elite Chinese communities in elite diasporic Chinese communities, right, become these platforms and spaces for political agitation and political movements, mobilization for in their home country. And this is certainly the case in Taiwan, which is like, which Wendy Chang talks about. But increasingly you just see in ethnic studies, like folks are talking about this, not just in the Asian American case, but in the case of Iranian Americans as well. You might want to look at the work of Ida Yalzaida as well, because she talks also about like international students and the sort of political agitation. So I'm wondering a little bit more about that, like because you kind of tell the stories of it's like, okay, now they're you know n now all of these organizations are focused on kind of assimilation and integration into American, maintaining their cultural, heritage to their children. So I suspect there's something a little more complex there. Maybe it was your archive, maybe it was further, you're going to elaborate in further chapters. And then, as a religion scholar, finally, I'm just curious, like, what happens to the Christianity? What happens to the religion in the Midwest CSAS? Because like everything, it seems like in this newsletter, everything that's mentioned is now it's become purely like a secular ethnic organization. But it is a explicitly Christian organization, right? So I'm just wondering what happens there. So, anyways, this is just fantastic, fantastic research. So excited about this. And I think that, this is really important for the understanding of religion in Chinese America.
Yeah, Professor Chen, and thank you so much for your wonderful comments. Very inspiring. And Joshua, would you like to make a response?
Yeah, okay, I'll respond briefly so we give time for other questions. So thanks very much for the reactions and sharing some of these very, very helpful comments and questions. I think to answer the three questions, so let me just try and kind of take them briefly. And I think a lot of the answers to the questions kind of come from I think the same fact of the very kind of unique demography of this group was that, they're very, the alumni is the alumni of Christian colleges in China, right? So I think that context matters a little, quite a bit because a lot of the community members that, from the CSAS, right, they eventually they came to the US at a very specific time, and so they are the generation of the early 1950s, and I think many of their children were born in the US in the 50s. I'm not sure that in the 60s and 70s, and maybe some later when somebody in the audience can correct me, but I don't think that it drew a lot to incorporate because there were obviously new generations of students coming in from Hong Kong and from Taiwan as well, right? So that were coming to the US, and so I do recall in CSAS newsletter, one of the children writing, right, our parents trying to get us to hang out more with those international students from Taiwan and Hong Kong, but they didn't really want to. So I think I'm not sure whether that there was a lot of continuing influx of right new members, or was it just simply the original group, right, that kind of formed together in the 50s, right, and then kind of pulled in more people coming in at the same time. So the Chinese at this time, right, they were studying Mandarin. In terms of who's Chinese, I think it was, of course, in some ways, a kind of mainland centered, maybe even Republican China kind of centered kind of Chinese. I mean, one of the few members who was actually not a China born was Joseph Lee, the architecture professor in Michigan, but his wife was an international student from one of the Christian college alumni in China. So I think so he became pulled in. So I think he was a Chinese Canadian. So very interesting role that he played. But I think he was in some ways an outlier. Um, and then for the second question, right, with this kind of the next generation, with any of them kind of engaging more in the kind of politics of the home countries, akin to like Wendy Cheng's Island X, right? And looking at the Taiwanese international students who became kind of more kind of politically active in the US, and they're kind of reflecting more on kind of the human rights issues in Taiwan. I think at least for the group that I that for organize this group, I haven't seen that. Although I have to ask more. I think maybe they were more concerned with the kind of maybe the second generation, more with kind of civil rights issues in the U.S. rather than in the homeland. And then for the generation of parents, I think they were less I'm not sure. A bit hard to say. I think they were less concerned with the politics in the homeland as they were with kind of reconnecting when opportunities presented themselves. So I think for many of like the men that I talked about briefly towards the end of the talk. Like they did cherish opportunities to visit, right? Visit, like, establish some kind of institutional professional relationship with Taiwan and Hong Kong. But I don't know to what extent that was connected with the kind of political leaning. I'm not sure. So I think they're probably a quite diverse group. I think when opportunities came up, I think they took them, and maybe some of it more opportunistic, some professional advancement, some of them maybe in Hong Kong, for instance, the pay was paid quite well. So yeah, so I think various different factors. And then the Christianity part, the last question, yeah, I think certainly it dropped out quite early. And again, like if there's anybody in the audience, maybe can shed light on this. But I do think that even with the original CSAS, I mean, they were missionary personnel, but their work was quite secular. So, at least one of the reasons that the United Board cites for closing it down, right? They were being outpaced by the conservative Catholics and the evangelicals, right? So, like if they were really doing kind of work in a more Christian idiom, but the CSAS stuff I think was more in the kind of humanitarian or kind of care counseling uh, orientation, which I think is yeah. So I think they would although many of the personnel were missionaries, former missionaries, I think they were very very kind of ecumenical in their orientation towards this work, right? I think they saw it generally as kind of care or kind of hospitality towards international students. Yeah. So maybe I'll leave it there, then maybe we can take more questions from the audience.
Yeah, thank you. So, Alan, would you like to share?
Yeah.
Yeah. First of all, Joshua, really fascinating talk. I mean, this is like literally hits home. This is my parents and some of the other Chinese family camp folks that are on the line. These are all of our parents that you are sharing about, and gives us a huge perspective on that early history, because it's always CSA. We, until you came along, we didn't realize there were other CSAS organizations around the country. It's like, what? We thought we were the only one, and we're the only one that kind of kept on going.
Yeah.
But to respond to Professor Chun's question about what happened to the religious nature, it's very interesting to see how camp has evolved over the decades, to the point now where we are vastly diverse. We have some families who are Jewish. We originally translated the doxology into Chinese, so we could sing that in Chinese before each meal. And one of the Jewish families says, doesn't quite work for us. So, and the whole adopted Chinese kids that was happening in the 90s. And so it's become an experiment in diversity of Chineseness, especially with these kids who have, Caucasian parents and Caucasian brothers and sisters, and they're trying to figure out, who the heck am I? And it speaks to, and it's also like, so how come there's no Chinatown Chinese in our camp? How come there's no Taiwanese? It's the spectrum of Chinese Americanness with very sharp boundaries. because there were just a few. There's one Chinatown family that kind of crossed over and kind of hang out with us. Um, like just a few Cantonese families, because the primary, first of all, the primary Chinese language was Mandarin. The primary demographic was professionals and PhDs and doctors and stuff. So it was kind of the economic kind of strata that we were in, and the kind of the scholastic strata that we were in, kind of really selected down to these are the folks that are just like us. And this is not only the parents, but us kids. It's like we're all the sons of the PhDs and the doctors and stuff. And we are those kids who had to play the lunch concert solo with people just stuffing their faces. It was, some campers have never come back because of that traumatic experience. But anyway, um, so that kind of speaks to how camp has evolved and how it's become just really diverse. It's just really this mix, but within that sort of strata of who our parents were and who we became from them. So just wanted to kind of give you some more context around how that all turned out. Um,
Thank you, Alan. That's
yeah,
super helpful.
yeah, and I appreciate what you're doing. I really, it's an interesting. I mean, and by the way, there's a religious spectrum of who camp is, who campers are now. Yeah, the same kind of mix of professional careers and stuff like that. Um, but it's really our kind of our core strength now is families with adopted kids. It's just a lot of them. If you browse the family camp website, you can see pictures of. There's one just beautiful picture of kids, 6 or 7 kids with albinism from 3 different families, and it's beautiful. It's just such a great, and everybody's welcome. Everybody's like, we're here together to be different together. So, but anyway, thanks, Josh, for really, really interesting talk. I was just madly scribbling down all these references and books and stuff because it's like, wow, there's so much more to this.
And Alan, thank you so much for sharing
Thank
the
you.
insider's perspective. And now the floor is open. And any questions for Joshar?
Hi, this is Jason Chow. So I'm also one of the children of my parents were immigrants, they came over to U.S. to study from China. And so I think Alan nicely summed up some of the perspectives of some of us. I think some additions to that, which is kind of like the next generation. So I know the focus of your research has been primarily around our parents' generation. And so, but just the perspective that, so that was an era when our parents, they were raising children in the 50s, and the McCarthy era and everything like that, that they wanted us to succeed. And to succeed, you had to speak English. And so the focus was not on teaching. I mean, at the one weekend at camp, you tried to learn a little Chinese, but the other message was we're going to speak English at home because we want you to be fluent so you can succeed at school. And so most of us were not fluent in Chinese. So when we got to college and we're meeting these Chinese students from Hong Kong, from Taiwan, who are fluent in Chinese, I couldn't get along with them because I couldn't speak Chinese. And so I think, and so when they come, I invited, occasionally I had some people come over, invited some people who were fluent in Chinese. It's like, and they came one year maybe. And then it's like, nobody speaks Chinese here. And so they're going to go someplace else where their kids can speak Chinese because they're speaking Chinese to their kids now. And so this isn't really a Chinese camp to them. So it had to evolve in a different direction where the Chinese language was not going to be a major focus.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks very much for sharing that.
Yeah, Tingje, please.
I I thank you for this fascinating paper and talk. So, and while I reading your research article, it kept kind of making me think about Philip Kim's Chinese among others, where he
Mm,
argues that obviously Chinese communities maintain strong ties to the mainland through all kinds of organizations, especially like native place
mm,
organization based on the dialect and like religious networks and commercial ties and so on and so forth. So which is why he argues that Chinese community, especially in Southeast Asia, tended to hold on to their Chinese identity very strongly. But your research
mm,
kind of shows a really different pictures for me. So the Chinese community in Americas in the post-World War II periods shift their identity quite quickly, right? This some of them seem very willing to pursue permanent residency and citizenship, and that
mm,
willingness became even more pronounced after the 1949. So I'm curious of how you situate your findings in relation to Hume's framework, because a statement like Clorox Champs that changes in U.S.-Chinese relations had no real impact on her community life, seemed almost unthinkable within the Philip Kim's framework. So that's my first questions. And my second question is about class. So
mm.
is there a class dimensions to this identity shift from Chinese to Asian American? So the people in your story came through academic channels and missionary networks, as far as I understand it. Do you think that they would have shown the same inclination toward American identity as Chinese working class immigrants who came through very different routes, probably 19th century and early 20th century? Or is what you are really capturing something specific to this educated elites, people who kind of already had a portable social capitals, and for whom ethnic identities, was more of a choice than survival necessities. So that's my two question. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much for the two questions. So I think on the first question with Philip Kuhn, yeah, so Philip Kuhn is a scholar of late imperial China that later in his life ventured into looking at the kind of global Chinese diaspora and thinking, building on work in kind of global migration history. And somewhat for those, yes, I think his big thesis was that there was a kind of corridor that connects, kind of Chinese communities in the diaspora with China. And I'm a little bit critical of his approach. I think he tried to, I think use this kind of social history approach to look at these large scale processes, right? And I mean, of course, there is a corridor, but I think the corridor can be kind of quite flexible in terms of how we're approaching. I mean, of course, there are some ties with China, but the ties in China kind of shift over time, right? Right. So he looked at, native place organizations, commercial organizations, predominantly in the kind of 19th, 20th century. So in my work, I think I want to kind of shift gears a little bit, right? So not thinking only of kind of place-based kind of bounded institutions, which are of course very, very important for many kinds of immigrant communities. But if we kind of look at and to the second question, right, the class dimension, right, the kind of particular kind of the unique circumstances of this group, for instance, like student immigrants, right, scholars, professors, then I think what kind of binds people to what connects these kind of networks of mobility quite different. So it could be, like alumni associations, right? Alumni association is kind of like a native place, but your place is tied to whatever college you attended, in China or in the US. And for, even in terms of those that became academics that kind of relocated later on, you think about academic mobility, right? It's very much shaped by, infrastructures of universities or higher education that can accommodate these academics, right? Recruitment network. So I'm trying to kind of shift in that direction. So I do have a kind of in my broader work a dialogue with scholars of migration, but really kind of thinking about this particular context, right? The Cold War, how kind of maybe new infrastructures of higher education, universities across Asia and America really kind of produce new kind of mobilities, at least for this very specific group. Yeah. So in terms of the quote that there was no impact on life in America. I think that was kind of really kind of a reflection that they didn't see of course, Sino-American relations necessarily changing anything, right? Whether the US, recognize Taiwan or recognize the PRC. Of course, for some people, it's very, very important, but for some others, well, at some point, right, it's been 30 years, right? Maybe, it didn't matter to her much. And then the class I mentioned, yeah, I guess I will say, yeah, of certainly. And I mean, the fact that the community was able to, I think, do very well in terms of professional life, in terms of, I think there's a kind of much broader literature about, Chinese American, especially after the 65 Immigration Act that looks at that phenomenon, right? Madeline Shu's book on the good immigrants, right? The really centers that the class mentioned, like the unique experiences of students, right? Even from the exclusion era all the way till 60s and 70s. Yeah. Thanks very much for the question. Yeah. Mm.
And yeah, here we have a question from
Yeah.
Shachan J, and
Yeah.
put it in the chat.
Mm. Yeah, okay. So to Shatrunjay's question was to talk more about the missionary archives. Where are they located and how did I access them? Yeah, so thanks Shatrunjay. Yeah, Shatrunjay is a friend. So the missionary archive that I started with is the archives of the United Board, of course. It's located at Yale Divinity School in New Haven. And I would say the interesting thing about the missionary archive is that for a long time, scholars have only studied the missionary archives in terms of the institutions that they was in terms of the institutions that they were sponsoring, and that's how the archive, for the most part, is organized, right? So you have different university or college, whatever, right? And then they have an institutional archive, right? The board, like kind of call the individual board of trustees, right? Faculty, departments, etc., etc., etc. But what I found interesting when looking at this archive that has historically been used to study Chinese higher education was that it actually can tell us quite a lot about kind of Chinese in America, right, in the 50s, because the archive literally spills over into the 50s, right? And then there are these addendums, and these addendums have stuff to do with, stuff like the CSAS or the scholarships in America that don't really fit neatly into these institutional kind of framework or these institutional or place-based kind of ways of cataloging. So that was quite interesting for me, right? In terms of thinking, even in terms of how the United Board started to catalog or kind of organize the stuff that it was doing in the US. Where does it fit, right? It doesn't fit with any of these institutions, right? And so they created kind of new addendums to it. And then later on, of course, the other addendums, right, when their work is more firmly set in East and Southeast Asia, right, Japan, Hong Kong, or Taiwan, and then you have kind of these new institutional kind of ways of organizing or cataloging the information. But then in between, right, that messy period in the aftermath of kind of 1949, 1950, right, that's the stuff that I found quite generative. That opens up new ways that help me think about kind of these mobilities in that period. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. And
Thank
personally,
you.
I
Yeah.
have two questions. The first one is
Yeah.
that I think that the narrative of your paper and your talk is basically centers um, on 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 the Christian community in the United States. But I'm wondering if we can redirect the attention to the other side of the Pacific. You talked about the Donghai University and what happened. So how did the Donghai University deal with the absence of these expected human resources? Because they expect that this group of people come to serve in the overseas higher education institutions, but in the end they didn't. So how will
Mm.
this change in the composition of the faculty members in Donghai University? How did he deal with this change, and how will this change? How will this unaccepted composition change the an educational system in Donghai University? That's my first questions.
Mm.
And my second question is that in the very beginning of the talk, you mentioned about the work of David Hollinger. We know that the basic idea of David Hollinger is that the missionary associate people or the descendant of the missionaries, they after coming back to the United States, they became prominent people in the United States, and they changed the social perception of the China or Asia more broadly of the
Mm.
China, of the U.S. people. So I'm trying to ask similar questions. So how would the people who you describe stay in the United States in the end, how will this group of people change the social perception of China or Chinese diaspora in the States?
Yeah, so thanks for the two questions. So to answer the first question, yeah, so I did mention briefly about United Board, right? So kind of all of the energies and finances, right, or at least most of it went to kind of developing Donghai University in Taiwan, and so there was this expectation, and so even in the early years of the founding, I mean, there was a great tension between Donghai, kind of the Chinese leadership as well as the United Board, right? So this is a big tension because United Board was providing the money, but of course, based in Taiwan, there's still kind of some oversight by the Chinese Nationalist Party. Um, and so a lot of the personnel decisions that United Board made were eventually kind of foiled or at least challenged by kind of local leaders. So I think that's a very uh, interesting tension that I'm trying to explore in the broader book project that I'm working on. So for instance, like there was kind of great difficulty in staffing the role of the president, right? Because, United Board presented one candidate and then kind of he stayed for a while and then he kicked out. And then, the local kind of the Taiwan side appointed candidate gets in conflict with United Board, get kicked out, and then United Board appoints another candidate. And so there's kind of very difficult kind of in terms of navigating these kind of reconstruction of new institutions. That's I think one of the kind of areas that I'm trying to develop in my broader project as well, right? These kind of so-called kind of American Asian kind of educational collaborations in the Cold War, how difficult they were, and the different constituents, different agendas, but they all converge because of their desire to support Chinese higher education outside of China, right? So. In the Donghai side, I guess I'll also state that one of the few grantees of the United Board sponsors students that eventually went back by the name of Wu Yao, right? So I'm actually trying to write a separate maybe project that's going to lead into a biography of him. So he's one of the few that gave up their green cards, right? So he went back to Donghai and he was rewarded with a position of Dean of Arts when he was very young in his 30s. And then later on, he became president of Donghai, even though he had zero experience. And so he I think got bullied a little bit by the oldest scholars in Taiwan because of his lack of experience. But he was very well connected in America. So I think this is another story that I've been trying to tell separately. And then in terms of the second question about David Hollinger's work, and right, so his book I think is Protestants Abroad, right? How missionaries try to change the world but change America, right? So one of the arguments he makes there is that this missionary kind of children of missionaries, former missionaries, they played a very, very big role in kind of changing the perception of Asia within kind of American intellectual kind of policy circles. So I think that the question of how this generation of Chinese student migrants, I guess, changed perception of maybe Asia or Asian America. I think that's work that's been done by other scholars in looking at kind of the development of kind of model minority kind of myth in the post-war United States. I'm not really doing that in this work, but I think what I was trying to quote from Holland is really the way in which we can think about the missionary movement as a kind of with all these kind of unexpected legacies, right? Moves in multiple directions that, were never really foreordained, right? Some of the most interesting legacies are stuff that really go beyond what we can think of as the boundaries of church history or kind of mission history. So I think that was my attempt to try and engage a little bit with this work. Yeah. Ifan, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Ifan, please.
Yeah. Ifan.
Hey Josh,
Yeah.
glad
Ifan,
to
yeah.
see you after almost a year. Yeah, I'm so happy to read your paper and hear your wonderful presentation. It's very compelling. I really appreciate your perspective of bringing us the attention to these personal letters between missionaries and the students, which gives the story the kind of a warmth that is hard to get from usually like the government archives or records. I have two questions. The first one regards the regional difference. So you focus on the Midwest CSAS as a major case study. Given that the other centers in East Coast, West Coast, uh, um, in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Seattle took quite different paths. Some absorbed into churches, others just dissolved. So, what do you think made the Chicago community specifically resilient and self-sustaining? Was it the demographic character of the Midwest community, or something more structural, or something related to the particular personalities about the some of the leaders, for example, the Alan Studley, right, who built it. And the second question is that given the current moment of renewed U.S. China tensions, do you see any parallels between this 1950s community formation that your paper described and the experiences of today's Chinese international students in America? Yeah, these are my two questions.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ivan, for the two questions. So I think in terms of the first question, regional differences, um, I I guess the most well documented are the New York and the Chicago. I think New York because the board kind of head office was in New York, and there was such a great concentration of missionary kind of boards that were all headquartered in New York, 155th Avenue. So, I think New York was kind of in some ways unique in the sense that there were already so many, and not only Christian but also right like the Protestant, but also the Catholic I mentioned, right? Archbishop Yu Bin, and then others like quasi governmental like the China Institute in America, right? So already I think New York was a really kind of important center, right? And this, as well as Columbia University Teachers College, it had among the largest numbers of Chinese students, right? The NAFSA, right? The National North American Foreign Student Advisors, they were also kind of headquartered in New York. So there was a great energy already in New York. And so the other smaller regional centers, I think not as well documented. So I don't know so much about them. Although I think well, now that you're living in Seattle, maybe you can dig up some of the early information about the Seattle. I think many of the kind of very very illustrious scholars that were University of Washington, Seattle, I think were also affiliated with the Washington Seattle CSAS. Now the Chicago Center, I think. According to my missionary Ellen Studley, I mean, she was a kind of women's missionary with the North kind of Methodist Conference for many years. And I think what made Chicago important was that there were not so many similar kind of community groups dedicated to Chinese students. So I think one important thing was right, Alan Young gave a thumbs up. So I think yeah, it's true. And they were going there for stuff like for immigration kind of advice, right? If you couldn't hire attorney, right, you could go and ask missionaries for help, or looking for friends, right? If they know somebody that had was studying somewhere but they didn't know where to find them, right? They kept kind of these roles. And then another thing that they did, and I don't think some of the other centers did, was that they hired a full-time like Chinese member of the staff to visit the various college towns across the region. So that was quite interesting, going to Indiana and Michigan and checking on the various Chinese students, and then organizing the student rally, right? So the student rally, which if initially was a very, very big event, I think later on the family camp becomes more important, right? There's more alumni rather than students. But initially, right, they had the student rally. So within a few years, I think 1953 to 57, right, they got a very, very kind of large attendance from the group. So yeah, so I think these are some factors that contribute to the distinctiveness of the Chicago Center. And then the second question about the current moment U.S.-China tension, I think it's an interesting one, right? So, in some ways we can say that this 1950s moment of kind of Sino-American tensions gave rise to new communities in America. Actually, my kind of living in Singapore and having been writing a little bit about kind of educational mobilities, in these times of geopolitical tensions, I think it's kind of almost like the opposite now because within the current moment of U.S. China, I think there's a kind of pattern of like Chinese scholars in the U.S. leaving for Asia, right? In ways that was not possible in the 1950s, and I think this has to do kind of with the broader kind of infrastructures of higher education in Asia that was not yet developed to the extent that it was in the US in the 50s. But now I think like the 2010s 2020s, and of course China, mainland China's universities of course are trying to attract talent, right, academics from the US, researchers, scientists. Places like Hong Kong or even Singapore where I'm living is also trying to do that. So I mean, it's almost as if like I think this rupture in kind of attention in kind of U.S. China is also creating new kind of ties across the Pacific, right? So whereas in the 50s maybe it was kind of local communities within the U.S., right? So it's almost, I think, the opposite is taking place. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for all your wonderful questions, and we have run out of time. But by the end of the talk, I would like to use 1 minute to promote the next event of this talk series. And the next reading group event, the next guest lecture will be given by Dr. Ting-Je Ouyang, and he just received his PhD degree and in the Department of History at the University of Washington, Seattle. And the title of his talk is How Did Non-Official Literati Imagine Alien Geographies? Yes or Puyan and the confusion and anxieties over heterodoxy. And the talk will be taking place on May 29 at 5 o'clock. Yeah. And finally, again, many thanks to Joshua and many thanks to Professor Chen, and thank you for your wonderful intellectual inspiration you brought to the event. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and if you have more questions,
Thanks,
please
everybody.
feel free to reach out to Joshua. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Yeah.
Thank you, Joshua.
Thank you.
Thank you for organizing this, Hu. It was wonderful.
Yeah, thank you.